What's going on, guys, and welcome back. Today we are going to work on mesh and shaders. I know I said that we were going to work on FBOs, but I figured might as well get something rendering on the screen instead of waiting another episode. And uh, we'll just do FBOs later. There's really no rush. We can go ahead and set up the hierarchy and get all that fun stuff out of the way first, because it's all going to be rendered onto one FBO anyways, so there's no point even doing it right at this moment. So where we left off, we have a window. We've got the color class set up. We're just rendering yellow in the background. So let's go ahead and create a mesh class. We'll call it mesh. So let's go ahead and create some variables. So first variable we need is the VID. This is going to be the ID for the vertices. And a UID, which the UID will be the texture coordinates or UV coordinates. Now we need private int VAO. This is our vertex array object. So now that we got those, we need to build the constructor for the mesh. And what we're going to do is pass in, what am I doing? Pass in a float array of vertices and a float array of UVs. Why did I make that a class? There. Okay, so private float array vertices, private float array of UVs. I don't think we really need to do this, but in case in the future, like for collision detection or whatever it is we need in the future, we'll go ahead and have what we need up here, so we won't have to mess with adding that later. And just in case, so say this dot vertices equals vertices. This dot UVs equals UVs. So that just puts it there in the thing that we need. Okay, so now we need to create the VAO. So we need to go VAO equals GL30 dot GL gen vertex, if I can spell correctly, vertex arrays. And import GL30. And then do GL30 dot GL find vertex array. And then we are going to pass in the VAO. So that's going to bind the VAO that we just created right here. Just created and put in the variable. Whoa, okay. GL gen buffers. Then we're going to need to import some stuff, which I'll just do that later instead of messing around with it right now. So then we're going to bind the buffer. So GL bind buffer, GL array buffer. And then we're going to pass in the VID. And once again, I will mess around with this later. No import. Okay. So apparently I messed up my import settings, or my import setup earlier, which I'll deal with that later. So we're going to buffer data, and then do create buffer. Why is it not wanting to create buffer vertices? And then what we're going to do is use GL static draw, because we are not going to have to change this. It's going to be a permanent thing. So now we need to do the vertex trib pointer. So GL20 dot GL vertex trib pointer, and the index is going to be 0, and it's going to be the size of not vertices dot length. So we're going to start at 0 and go to vertices dot length divided by 3. And then GL float. And normalized, we do not want it normalized. The stride, we're going to do 0, and the pointer 0. And then do GL15 dot GL bind buffer, and set the target to GL15 dot GL array buffer, and buffer is 0. Sorry if I'm kind of skimming along through here, not really explaining much, because we have a lot of stuff to get through before we can actually get something onto the screen, because I'm completely skipping over the immediate mode drawing. I am going to straight into shaders. So we're going to have to take care of all this in order to get something rendering onto the screen. So I'm just kind of going through it and somewhat explaining in sections, but not really going too far into detail because I want to get this done. So we're going to generate the buffer for the texture coordinates ID. And then what we're going to do is we're going to bind the buffer. And then we're going to use a GL array buffer. I hate it that I don't have this stuff set up. It's really annoying me. But I'll have it set up here in just a minute. So after we bind the buffer, just like before, we need to do the buffer data and then set it to GL array buffer. And hold on just a minute, because I got somebody whispering. Okay, I'm back. Alright, so we get the buffer data, pass in the GL array buffer just like we did before, except for this time we're going to pass in the texture ID and that. I've got my notes all scattered. And what the hell am I doing right here? There we go. Sorry, my got all confused. Trying to do the same thing I did just a minute ago. Okay, we need to create the buffer, pass in the UVs, and call once again GL static draw. Now create buffer is going to be a function that we're going to create here in just a few minutes. So this isn't anything built in, it's something that we're going to do. So after all that, we can just call GL find buffer, GL array buffer, and 0. So we're just unbinding all this. Since we're all done passing in the information that we need to pass in. So I think we can probably just go ahead and move on to the create buffer function. Just to get that out of the way. So do public yeah, okay. Public float buffer and create buffer. Going to be passing in a float array of data, which could either be the vertices or the textures. Ooh, something I can actually import. Okay. So then going to create a buffer. So buffer equals, we're going to be using buffer utils dot create float buffer, and then the capacity we're going to be using data dot length, because the length of the data is or could be different depending on the vertices or UVs or whatever. So we're just gonna create the buffer using that length, and then do buffer.put, and then we're going to put the data in there. And then third, we're going to flip the buffer, and then we're going to return the buffer. And now that's all away. So it creates the buffer and then passes it into the places that we need it to go to. Now we need to have a function to clean up. And what cleanup does is, cleanup is something that you do on just about anything that you use. What it does is it deletes the vertex array object and deletes the buffer. So it's just something that you use after, say you close the application. While it's closing, you're just cleaning up everything that you do. So you'll clean up from the mesh, the textures, just about any data that you use. So we're going to call GL30 dot GL delete vertex arrays, and we're going to pass in the VAO. So that's going to delete that for the VAO. Then we need GL15 dot GL delete buffers, and then we're going to pass in the VID. And And then the last thing that we need to do, and then we'll import all this crap. I'll have to look at my notes to see what all I need to import. And maybe I'll go in and see how I set that up wrong before and see why my imports are not working correctly. So first thing we need to do in the render function is we need to bind the VAO. So we need to call gl30.glbind vertex array, and then we're going to pass in the VAO. We're going to also be using attributes. So we're going to pass in, or the first thing we're going to bind for the attributes is the vertices, the positions for the vertices, and the UV coordinates. That way that inside of the shader we can access those. So we're going to GL enable vertex attrib array. Hopefully I spelled that correctly. I probably did, but yeah, with the import settings all screwed up, only God knows. Okay, GL enable vertex attrib array 1. There we go. So now 0 is going to be positions and 1 is going to be texture coordinates. So now that we've got those enabled, now we can bind the vertex ID. So we do GL bind buffer, go GL need the array buffer, and pass in the VID. And then do our normal pointers. So I'll do vertex attrib pointer, and we need 0. It's going to be the first thing, so we're going to bind this one. And there's 2 floats for our positions, because all we care about is X and Y. We don't care about Z, because, well, it's for 2D. So, obviously. They are floats, so we're going to use GL float. False, 0, 0. The other one will be exactly the same because we're also using floats. Same information for everything, just changing this right here to a 1 because that's going to be our second attribute that we're going to be passing in. So we can actually just copy this. We can paste it right there. Change this to UID, and then all we have to do is change this to a 1. So we're going to be passing the U, or the texture stuff, into the second attribute. And then we need to draw it. So we're going to be using GL draw arrays. We're going to be using triangles and 0. Alright, and I'm going to bind the buffer, do GL underscore array underscore buffer 0, And yes, there's actually one more that needs to go up here because we're going to be using 6 elements in there. Okay, so after we bind the buffer, then we need to, after we bind it back to 0, or unbind it, whatever you want to call it, we're going to disable the attributes. So GL disable vertex attrib array 0 to GL disable vertex trib array 1. And then we need to, yes, bind the vertex array back to 0. So GL30 dot GL bind BER, Jesus, vertex array back to 0. Well, thankfully, that is it besides the imports that we need to use. Alright, so here's what we're importing. Actually, I don't need that. Okay. So here is what we're importing. And I did some typos down here that will need to be fixed. So change that to a capital B. Put an I right there. And then that is it for the mesh class. Thank God. Now I only got one more big class to go through, and that is the shader class.